You are listening to the Reformanda Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical perspective. My name is Clay Kennard. I'm sitting here in the city center of Rome with the Associate Director of the Reformanda Initiative, Reed Carr. Reed, how are you doing today?
All right. Thanks, Clay.
Good. Well, we have a special episode. We've had some guests recently on our episodes, and we're going to do that again today. And Reed, why don't you introduce our friend for us today?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. Yeah, we're excited to continue to have some guests on and hear some other people contribute to the podcast, and not just the three of us. But we have Lauren Moore with us this morning, and Lauren is a longtime friend of ours. She's been a faithful tender of the Rome Scholars and Leaders Network, and that's how we got to know her. She's also contributed to it, done presentations for us, and so we've enjoyed getting to know Lauren over the years. And seeing her occasionally at here in Rome when she comes to visit. And Lauren is actually a PhD candidate also at the Union School of Theology, where I am also a PhD candidate, and we have a partnership with. And she is studying a very interesting topic that we know our listeners will appreciate and enjoy learning more about, and that is the topic of Marian Apparitions. And we'll let her talk more about it, but it's a fascinating topic that probably most of us don't know a whole lot about. We've probably heard of them, but it'll be an interesting episode to dive into Marian apparitions and why they're so important and to so many millions of Roman Catholics around the world, and how should we as evangelicals understand them, especially if we are engaged in a conversation with a friend or a family member that would be moved by some type of situation like that, and want to visit it possibly or learn more about it. So we're excited to have Lauren with us. Lauren, thanks for taking the time to do this. Lauren's there right now in Melbourne, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, she's in
Good to
Melbourne,
be here.
which is 6 hours ahead of us, and she was just telling us that there were virtually zero COVID cases in Australia, and has been that way for 3 months. So things are kind of getting back to normal there. But Lauren, thanks for your time, and just tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind, before we dive into the topic.
Yeah, sure. My name's Lauren. I've been in mostly serving the Lord in France for the past 12, 13 years, working with an organization called Pioneers and doing church planting across Southwest France. And like Reed said, I'm a PhD candidate at Union School of Theology, which I've been doing for just over 2 years now. So right in the heart of the PhD study at the moment and my dissertation. And I hope to go back to France this summer. So we'll see.
In your PhD studies, before we get into Marian apparitions in general, what is that looking like? Are you having to concentrate on a specific apparition or a certain aspect of the apparitions, or tell us a little bit about what you're researching?
Yeah, so a lot of apparitions are studied individually, but what I'm hoping to do is look at them more globally and look at throughout history apparitions, what influence have they had on Roman Catholicism. So I will use some apparitions as case studies, but I'm trying to look at a broader picture as to how influential these occurrences are on Roman Catholicism.
Great. So before we get into the meat of our discussion, tell us exactly what an apparition is, just in case our listeners are wondering exactly what that is. What is a Marian apparition?
Okay, so a Marian apparition is, we might say in sort of everyday language, a vision of Mary. So it's when someone sees Mary. But the difference between what we would call a vision of Mary and an apparition is a vision is more something that happens in the mind. So you're seeing something in your mind. It might be a dream or something like that. Whereas an apparition is considered to be, by the Catholic Church at least, and by Catholics, as an appearance of Mary. So that's an instance when Mary actually appears. So it's a physical manifestation of the Virgin Mary. We shorten it to say a vision of Mary. There is a distinction, but it's people who and situations where Mary apparently appears to visionaries.
Okay, yeah, that's a helpful distinction to make, and it's a very clear one. So this is an actual, when we're talking about an apparition, an actual appearance of Mary herself. Is it always to an individual, or does it ever happen to groups, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's been quite a few that have happened to a group or a couple of people. So it happens most often with one person, but it is also very common to have a few people experience the same apparition. It often happens, they might have a series of apparitions. So like the first person might has an apparition, and then other people follow to see what all the fuss is about, and then other people will see it as well. So it's a variety of different experiences and encounters.
And how often are these apparitions happening? Is it something that happens on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a yearly basis, once in a blue moon? How often are we talking about that people are claiming to have seen Mary?
It's actually a lot more common than we think about. So as far as what has been recorded by René Laurentin, who is a Mariologist, a studier of Mary, he has recorded about 2,400 over history. So it's quite a lot. and then after that, he also recognises that we can never record every single apparition that has supposedly happened, because a lot of people might say they had an apparition in their bedroom in the middle of the night, and that's not something that's considered a private apparition. So they're not always recorded, and you don't always share those. So basically the number in many ways is kind of infinite, but the ones that have been recorded are about 2,500 apparitions throughout history.
And when you say 2,500 throughout history, are we talking all the way back to the very first believers, the early church, or when did they start counting those?
So the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church will say that there are beliefs that Mary even appeared before the end of her life. So as early back as I think 60 or 70 AD, it's believed that there are people who believe that she appeared in another part of Europe. So I think she appeared in Saragossa. So it's been happening supposedly since the very beginning since Christ, the time of Christ, basically. But they didn't actually start really recording them until centuries later, when they actually started recording some of these stories. And earlier on in history, it's really hard to determine how much of it is true and how much of it is kind of embellished storytelling to encourage people in their devotion to Mary.
Hey, Lauren, I have a question. These appearances of Mary, what is the form of these appearances? For example, is it the spirit of Mary appearing to certain people? Is she appearing in other forms? For example, let's say a water stain in the shape of Mary on the side of a building. If that makes sense, how exactly does she appear to people?
Yeah, there's so many different ways that she appears. There are those ones, like you said, where she appears in a stain on a cloth, or and we laugh at the ones when we hear stories about appearances on pieces of toast and things like that. But actually, the most common is that she just appears as a person in front of them, or above them, or sometimes sometimes she's supposedly hovering above a space or things like that. But what is really interesting is that she appears dressed differently every time. So you can actually tell in some of the images that we see in Roman Catholicism, you can look at a picture and go, oh, that's Our Lady of Lourdes, because that's what she looked like. That's what we've been told she looked like when she appeared in Lourdes. And then that's one's Fatima, because we can tell that. But yeah, it's most common that she comes just as a normal person in a space in front of them. But there are other instances. Sometimes statues start talking. Sometimes, she just appears. Sometimes, like you said, on pieces of fabric and things. So there's such variety in these occurrences that it's difficult to sort of pinpoint. But yeah, most commonly I would say she appears just in front of them. Yeah.
When would be the most recent apparition of note? And one reason I ask that too is just to see, has anyone ever claimed to have in some way documented a Marian apparition, or snapped a quick picture or something of that nature? So when would have been the most recent one of note, and anybody ever claimed to have made documentation of it?
I don't know of any that have made documentation per se, but people try in, I'm going to butcher this word, but Medjugorje, Anyway, it's a place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is more of a controversial one, but the Virgin Mary supposedly appears once a month in that town. And so lots of people go there. I think they have tried to film things. They try and film the people having the visions as well, or the apparitions. So they try and film to see what happens to the person if they see anything. Often I think they tried as well to record in Fatima, but they just sort of often end up with a really blurry shot or a bright light in the spot where supposedly Mary was appearing. In Fatima, one of the things so Fatima was in early 1900s, and one of the key things about that one was that there were like 3,000 or 4,000 witnesses to an astrological event that happened during the apparitions. So there were lots of witnesses, to something like that. But yeah, recording, there's been no pictures circulating ever of things, of people having visions or photos of apparitions. But yeah, people try and sometimes fail or just get nothing. So it's people try everything to sort of prove it scientifically, or with photos or with recordings, or things like that. But nothing has really, nothing recorded.
Lauren, what was the astrological event that accompanied the apparition in Fatima?
I think it was like a sun. I don't think it was an eclipse, but it was like something, bright lights in the sky. So it was this big bright lights in the sky. I can't remember exactly the details of it, but they do, again, they try and explain it with astronomy, but I don't think it's a rare occurrence in any case that it would happen. But yeah, it was bright lights. I can't remember exactly.
Okay. Let me ask two questions. Throughout the history, are there, in your mind and in your research, which apparitions stand out as the most famous that people may be familiar with and that have maybe generated the most pilgrimages? And is there any common theme to understanding why those are more well-known and famous than others? So which ones would be the most famous that people may be familiar with, and why do you think that they stand out amongst others?
Yeah, so we've in the world at the moment, the most well-known ones are Lourdes in France. There's Fatima in Portugal. There's Częstochowa in Poland, and then there's one in Mexico City called Our Lady of Guadalupe. They would be the main ones, and then you've got as well in Ireland Our Lady of Knock. So they're the main ones that are well known today. Interestingly enough, except for the one in Mexico City, all of them have happened in the past 150 years or so, because they talk about the Marian Century. So there's a century sort of starting midway through the 19th century, a quarter of the way into mid-19th century, until Fatima, where there was just an increase in the number of apparitions around the world, especially in Europe. And so it's interesting because all the ones that are quite famous these days are around throughout that Marian century, have occurred during that Marian century. So they're still quite new in the scheme of 2,000 years of Christianity. So yeah, they're still quite new. They're popular for various reasons. I know in Lourdes, for example, there was a few factors. Some of them are just really practical. They built a train line a year after the apparitions occurred, and so it was accessible, and so people could go there. There were other things. Lourdes is apparently a place of healing, and the empress's son was healed by Lourdes water. So then the empress, gave it credibility and gave it popularity even among the richer classes of France. And it's also the content of those of those apparitions. So, for example, Lourdes is a place of healing. So if people have that desire to be healed, they go to Lourdes because they've heard that Mary told them to wash in the water there and they would be healed. And there are, stories of people being healed by washing in the water. So a lot of them that are related specifically to healing, even Fatima has a link with healing. In that instance, it's more about going to Fatima because you've received healing and you want to thank and honour the Virgin Mary for receiving that healing. So I think it is related a lot to what you can get out of that particular apparition. And there's some really obvious things that you can get out of Fatima or Lourdes. And then places like Częstochowa and in Poland and Mexico City, they're very linked in with national identity. And so it's a cultural thing to go on pilgrimage to visit these apparition sites. And so that's why I think Guadalupe is actually the biggest as far as how many people go on pilgrimage there every year, because the visionary, so Juan Diego, was considered almost the patron saint of South America. So he would come, so everyone would come sort of symbolically because it's part of their identity, not just spiritually as Roman Catholics, but also as their national identity is all tied in with people like Juan Diego, who had visions of the Virgin Mary in the 15th century.
That answers a question that I had. I think a lot of our listeners would have is what is the appeal and attraction to pilgrims who would go to these places, and are they hoping that Mary would make another appearance, but it makes sense to go there for hoping to be healed, or in the case of Fatima to thank her for healing or close cultural ties, which leads me into the question that you kind of brought up as you were diving into your research with Union and trying to understand what is the impact of these Marian apparitions on Roman Catholicism in general. And I know you still have a lot to go with your research, but what are you finding and what have you found up to this point in the larger, looking at Roman Catholicism in a larger sense? What impact does it have, and how important is it to the overall Roman Catholic picture?
Yeah, I think definitely as evangelicals, we underestimate the influence of things like this. And I would suspect that even in Roman Catholicism, they might even underestimate it as well, in the sense that these occurrences they don't begin inside the church. They're spontaneous, random. You can't predict who's going to have an apparition and when. And so in that sense, they come from outside, and yet once they go through, they go to the local priests and they go through that whole process of determining, is this really the Virgin Mary or not? Then if it's approved or generally accepted, even if it's generally accepted and not really approved by the Roman Catholic Church, it's still, it influences what people believe about Mary. So, for example, the two later dogmas of Mary. So you've got the Immaculate Conception and you've also got the Assumption of Mary. So the Immaculate Conception is saying that Mary was born without the stain of original sin. And the Assumption of Mary is the belief that at the end of her earthly life, she didn't die, but she ascended up into heaven. So she never died physically. Those beliefs, especially the Assumption, I think is fueled by apparitions, because if you've got this person that keeps appearing century after century, year after year, there is this idea that she is still alive and still active and still present. And so it's not surprising then that in 1950 they declared that she didn't die. That was already a general belief that had been spurred on by these apparitions. And so I think it does influence it influences the theology and their Mariology, as we call it, definitely in that way. But I think one of the other things that it influences more than we realise is just the devotional day-to-day life of the everyday Roman Catholic believer, to different extents, but on the whole, there's a very strong devotion to the Virgin Mary amongst everyday Catholics, and that does eventually work its way up into the Roman Catholic Church on the whole, the structure, because they do take into account, Roman Catholicism does take into account what they call popular piety and popular belief. They do factor that in when they're thinking through, talking through, working through theological beliefs and theological doctrines and things like that. They do actually go, well, what's popular piety say? What is the popular belief? And that's how they come to something like the Assumption or the Immaculate Conception. They look at what the popular belief is. And so things like apparitions actually are fueling and driving a lot of popular piety. And then that in turn affects Roman Catholic theology.
Since Mariology is so rooted and so deep in Roman Catholicism, and it's even written, as you said, into their theology and dogma, is there any factions within Roman Catholicism that would say, no, we don't accept Marian apparitions, or is it something that just falls into and is accepted with popular piety, or would it be considered something that just is on the fringe of Roman Catholicism, or how would even Roman Catholics see it? Anybody would say, no, we don't accept those?
So there's no obligation to believe in apparitions. There are other things that there is things that need to be accepted, what they call de fide, by faith, and they have to be accepted as far as being a Roman Catholic. But apparitions don't make part of that. And because there's such a wide range of them, there are some that people just go, oh, that's just a crazy one. I don't really believe in that one. So there is sort of a rejection of some and not others. And Medjugorje is one of the ones that's in hot debate at the moment. And so they can kind of pick and choose which ones they think are right or true or not in that sense. The Roman Catholic Church has worked harder at kind of making a decision but not making a decision officially about these things. But yeah, I think they don't have to believe them. They don't have to believe that they occurred, but they tend to. I was talking to a priest the other day, and he asked me, not knowing that I was evangelical, he asked me which apparition do I have a fondness for, which I found such a strange question. But it's true, Roman Catholics typically will choose one that they have a fondness for, and they will pray not just to the Virgin Mary on the whole, but they'll go, oh, I pray to Our Lady of Lourdes, or I have a particular fondness for Our Lady of Fatima, or others. So it is a bit of pick and choosing, and there is as well there is, in the same way that you might find something like this in evangelical churches, where there's groups that go too far with their Mary stuff, and they will be rejected in some ways, or completely rejected. So there are different factions that would be considered by the Roman Catholic Church as going too far with their Mary adoration and veneration. Once they kind of get to the point where they're sort of not talking about Jesus at all, and they're just talking about Mary, that's sort of where the Roman Catholic Church, I think, probably draws the line, when it's not, because even popular piety, I think Pope Francis wrote something about this as well. When popular piety is not is not focused on the Eucharist, so if everything that comes out of popular beliefs, and also from apparitions, and also from all of this Mary veneration, if it doesn't lead people to the Eucharist, then it needs to be eliminated, basically. So all roads need to lead to the Eucharist, or the Mass, the Catholic Mass. And so that is true also of Mariology. That is true of popular piety. That's true of apparitions. That's the yardstick that they use. Does it point to the Eucharist? Does it point to the Mass? Does it lead people to that?
So would it be safe to assume, Lauren, that some of these fringe groups that have gone to the extreme would be the ones that are calling for Mary to be declared officially by the Church as co-redemptrix?
It will be a group that will have already declared her as co-redemptrix. So that word being co-redeemer with Christ, the idea that without Mary's obedience, without her free will obedience, Christ would never existed. Therefore, we couldn't have been saved without Mary. Therefore, she's co-redemptrix. And so that's not a dogma that has been declared, and it's not an official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. And so if that does get declared by a group, then they're outside of the Roman Catholic teaching. But there still is within Roman Catholicism, amongst Mariologists, there is the expectation that eventually that doctrine or that dogma will be declared at some point in some way. So it's not necessarily frowned upon within Roman Catholicism to discuss the possibility or the future of Mary being declared co-redemptrix, but it's not been declared yet. So if there's a group that's declaring it already, they're jumping the gun a little bit, and they're not within the framework of Roman Catholic theology.
Okay, thanks. I have another question. We've talked about Pope Francis in some of our previous episodes. Leonardo de Chirico's talked about him being a very Marian pope. Could you speak at all to Pope Francis's thoughts on these apparitions? Does he promote them?
He's extremely devoted to the Virgin Mary, but he also knows that there are a lot of Protestants watching him, so he plays it down a lot. But I think for me, the most significant thing for me when looking at Pope Francis is the first thing he did, the first morning after he was made Pope, was he got in a car or a taxi, stopped off at a florist, got a bunch of flowers, went to the Church of Mary Major in Rome and laid the flowers down and consecrated his entire papacy to the Virgin Mary. So for me, that was significant that was the first thing he did on his first day as Pope. He's also very devoted to Our Lady, the Untier of Knots, which is a painting, I think, in Germany that he discovered when he was studying, I think, in Germany. And he was very devoted to this painting, which is Mary, I guess, untying knots. I haven't seen a picture, but the idea that you pray to Our Lady, the untier of knots, for, I think it's a lot for like marital conflict and stuff, like when you're in a knot, I guess. So that's the Mary that you go to. And so he actually brought that back to South America. So I think he organised 4 little sort of prayer cards with the picture of Our Lady of Untier of Knots to go back to South America so that he could spread that message of Our Lady of the Untier of Knots. And I think since then there's been a replica of that painting done and is also in South America. So I think I don't know if that particular one is coming from an apparition, but that is typical kind of Marian apparition response, is to propagate that particular apparition. And he's done a lot to propagate that particular devotion to Our Lady, the Untier of Knots. It basically didn't exist, as far as I've read. It didn't really exist it didn't exist in South America until Pope Francis brought it back after his time in Germany.
Well, would you say that specific apparition probably is among the favorite for Roman Catholics who have a vocation in physical therapy or massage therapy as well?
Who knows? I need to look more into that apparition to know, but maybe.
Well, I've got 2 questions to wrap up with. The 2 very important questions. Of course, the Reformanda initiative exists to help evangelicals better understand and interact with Roman Catholicism. So, from an evangelical perspective, how should we understand these Marian apparitions? It's kind of a loaded question, but help us to think through that and understand them from an evangelical perspective.
Yeah. So the reality is that a lot of the apparitions might be considered hallucinations. Some are illusions, but there are a lot that are very compelling in the documents that you read. They're very compelling as far as, did this actually occur? Is this person having a hallucination or not? And so there is something going on. These things do happen. Not all of them are things happening. Some of them are hallucinations, some of them are illusions. But yeah, I think the reality of it is apparitions on the whole turn people to Mary, turn people to increase their devotion to Mary, and it will typically as well increase people's devotion to the church. It doesn't necessarily, or rarely do I see it resulting in a deeper devotion to the Lord Jesus. And so it turned, in Lourdes, there's been several occasions where I've watched pilgrimages where I've seen people physically bowing down to a statue of the Virgin Mary, and literally to do so they have to turn their back on the cross, which is a very clear visual image. But I think we need to understand that, these apparitions, they lead people away from Christ towards Mary, towards the church, the Roman Catholic Church. And for me, anything that leads you away from Jesus and to something else, or leads you to something else to get to Christ, anything that leads you away from Jesus in any way cannot be from God. And so that doesn't discount the devotion of the individuals. They're very devoted. It's a very profound and personal devotion for those Roman Catholics who go to these pilgrimage sites to see where there was an apparition of Mary. That is deeply personal, and so it is. There's no discounting their devotion and their heart and the sincerity of their devotion. but it's not leading to Christ. It's not preaching Christ crucified and resurrected. It's often preaching something similar or not quite there. And so, yeah, I think we need to, as evangelicals, that is something that we need to actually grapple with and try and think through and take seriously. I think on the whole, particularly with the whole Marian Apparitions thing, but Mary in general, I think we don't take seriously enough how central she is to Roman Catholicism. What we might discount as, oh, that's just a bit of the weird fringy Catholicism, the mysticism and things like that. That's not at all the case when it comes to apparitions of Mary. They're very central to Roman Catholicism. They're a strong part of everyday life for a Roman Catholic. And we don't hear about it probably because it is so personal. And so when we're talking with our Roman Catholic friends or family members, we have to be aware that it is deeply personal when we're talking about their devotion to Mary, which often is connected in with all these apparitions. We have to be aware that that's the really, really personal part of their Roman Catholic faith. And so we have to tread lightly with a lot of grace and a lot of compassion, and not necessarily criticism for their desire to go on pilgrimage, for example. We often look at that and think, oh, that's just a weird thing that they do. But look at it from a perspective of when a Roman Catholic goes on pilgrimage, they're going, most of the time they're going to a site where there was an apparition of Mary. So they're trying to go to a place where they think something supernatural happens, or where they think they're going to find something supernatural that they need. And so I understand that in the sense of, if I thought God was moving specifically in the city of Sydney, and I knew he was going to work in Sydney, of course I'd go there. I'd want to see what God was doing in Sydney or elsewhere. And so I understand that desire to pursue something powerful that is happening in the spiritual. So I don't think we need to be very compassionate and loving towards our Roman Catholic friends and family, because there is a sincere desire to see, maybe for them it's to see Mary move, but in some ways it's also they just want to see God move. And so I think we need to be aware that there is a hunger there, and that's what's driving it as well, but it's also very personal, and so they might not talk about it as often. But yeah, we need to tread lightly, but realize that it's very central to their belief system, and it's very central to their everyday life as a believer of Roman Catholicism.
That you answered my last question, which was, how do evangelicals or any of our listeners who may have a family member or a friend who is very devoted to Mary, and not necessarily just to the apparitions, but if you're devoted to the apparitions, you'll be devoted to Mary. The two go together, and how to address that, because it's not something that you're just going to go in and have probably an apologetic, a debate about, and let me try to reason you away from your Mariology. Is so deeply ingrained, it's so personal, it means so much to them as an individual that just trying to present a few arguments may lack fruit, it may not bear fruit, and just how to interact with them. And it seems like, would it be safe to say that, as you said, tread lightly, try to put yourself in their shoes, and try to turn the conversation to Christ. And of course, that's the main error and danger of Mariology, is that it takes the focus off of Christ where it should be, and puts it in a place where it shouldn't be, because biblically speaking, Mary can't make the same claims as Christ, and not even close. So just trying to turn it to Christ, or I would imagine it's something that you have to understand is going to happen over a long period of time. Obviously, praying for them, exposing them to Scripture is there's no magical solution, no magical conversation to have, I suppose, but just trying to turn it to Christ.
Yeah, I think one way that I've described a Roman Catholic's devotion to Mary is often like either infatuation or thinking that because they're infatuated, they're therefore in love. And so that a lot of that emotive language when they're talking about the Virgin Mary is, it's similar to what you hear from someone who's completely infatuated. And the challenge with that is you cannot convince a person who's completely infatuated that it's not love. And so you can't reason someone out of being, infatuated with the wrong person or whatever. And so it's similar with the Virgin Mary in the sense you can't convince someone, you can't reason your way out of someone's devotion or infatuation or love to Mary because it's such a deeply powerful emotional attachment. And so, we need to be careful with how we talk about it for that reason. But, for an example, I have a friend and he very strong Catholic, and he said to me, well, my aunt was healed in Lourdes by going on pilgrimage to Lourdes where Mary appeared in 1858. She prayed to Mary and she was healed. That's not something that you can reason. You can't argue someone's experience, right? That's what their claim is. And, how do you share the love of Christ with someone who honestly thinks that their auntie was healed by the Virgin Mary? It's a lot more challenging. And our temptation is always to go, well, the Bible says this and Jesus says this. And, but it is emotional in many ways. It's an emotional attachment, but it's also relational. And that's the thing that makes me, I think, saddest about apparitions of Mary is those who have the apparitions themselves, who end up often becoming Roman Catholic saints. I wonder if they even had a relationship with the Lord Jesus, in the sense that once they've actually seen this apparition of the Virgin Mary, like their devotion goes totally to the Virgin Mary. And the question is, do these people who have visions of the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, do they actually know Christ and have a relationship with Christ? And I think that's the key in how we need to be, sharing our faith with Roman Catholics, because it's about relationship with Christ. And if we bring it back to relationship, the stronger their relationship with Christ, the easier it is to look away from Mary and enjoy Christ.
Lauren, that was extremely interesting and extremely helpful. Now we're out of time. Clay, do you have any last questions?
Nope, I don't.
Okay. Lauren, thank you so very much for all you've shared with us. I know our listeners will benefit from it greatly. And actually, a friend of Lauren's, which is a friend of ours, will be on our next episode, Mark Gilbert, who also has been a longtime contributor of the Rome Scholars and Leaders Network, and he will be joining us from Australia as well to talk to us about how to share the gospel with our Roman Catholic friends and family. It's a question we get often and when people email us about questions, so we're excited about that. But Lauren, thank you so very much. I hope you have a good evening here, and see you here in Rome again soon.
All right, see you soon.